Hi, in this lecture you will learn the types of DML triggers, statement level triggers and row level triggers. When we run a DML statement, as we learned from the previous lectures, the Oracle server fires the related triggers based on the events and timings. These specify when these triggers will be fired. But we can select our trigger to be fired for each row or for only that statement. So how? Let me explain on the previous example. We updated and deleted 107 rows in one step and our trigger is fired only for once. Let's do it again. This is called as statement level trigger. That means this trigger concerns only this statement. I mean, whether you update or delete one or multiple rows, this trigger will be fired only for once. If a DML statement is executed, and if this DML is specified in the trigger, the statement level trigger is fired for once for whole updates, deletes, etc. of a single request. If you do not specify the level of the trigger, it will be a statement level trigger by default. Since we did not specify anything for that in our trigger, our first trigger is a statement level trigger. If you run any update or delete commands on that table, this trigger will be fired for once. If you run another insert or delete statement, it will be fired again. One statement, one execution. But the key thing in here is, even if no row is affected from this execution, this trigger will be fired anyway. This is important. Maybe your update will not update any row, but anyway, this trigger will be fired since you executed a DML statement that's specified in the trigger. However, most of the times we want our trigger to run for each row, because we may want to add or modify some data for each row, or there might be so many reasons like that. To do that, we specify our triggers as row level triggers. If we specify our trigger like that, this time our trigger will be fired for each row that affected from that DML operation. For example, in here, we updated and deleted 107 rows. But since our trigger is a statement level trigger, it is executed for only once. But if we specify our trigger as row level, it will be fired for each row. That means 107 times. In here, a very important thing is, unlike the statement level triggers, if no row is affected from that DML operation, this trigger will not be executed. Besides, since the statement level triggers fire on the execution of whole statement, they don't know the old and new values of the columns. However, row level triggers know the old and new values and keeps them in the implicitly created records. You will learn old and new qualifiers in the next lectures. So let's pass to our slide now. This is our sample schema about the statement level and row level triggers. By the way, a table or view can have both statement and row level triggers together, but they must be different triggers. You cannot make them in one trigger without the compound triggers. Do not confuse about that. I will explain them all one by one. Okay, now let me explain you how the statement level and row level triggers work. As we know from the previous lectures, we have two timing identifiers, before and after. If we specify our trigger as before statement trigger, this trigger will be fired just before the statement is executed. This is important, by the way. If your trigger is before statement trigger, when you press the execute button for your SQL statement, it first fires the trigger. Right after the trigger finishes execution, the DML operation is done on the table. But if you specify your trigger as after statement trigger, first the DML operation is done on the table. After all the DML operations are done, the after statement trigger will be fired, right before the result is returned to the caller. But notice that if your query will update or delete 10 rows, for example, all 10 rows will be updated or deleted before the after statement trigger is executed. Now, between the before and after statement triggers, we have the before and after row triggers too. These triggers are bounded to the rows. I mean, if a row will be updated, deleted, or inserted before this DML operation, the before row trigger executed. And after the DML of that row, the after row is executed. So if your DML statement will update 10 rows, before row trigger will be fired in each time right before the specific row is updated. And the after row trigger will be fired right after the update of each column. So these triggers will be fired for 10 times. So how do we make a trigger as a row level trigger? It is so simple. We write only for each row text into the create quotes. I will show you on the examples. Alright, now let's create triggers for these 4 trigger types and see them working. Let's start creating a before statement trigger. Create or replace. This or replace is optional. We don't have to write it for now. And write trigger before statement amp copy. And write before insert or update on employees copy. And our begin keyword and our end keyword. And between them, I write dbms output dot put line and before statement trigger is fired. As you know, if you don't specify anything, our trigger will be a statement level trigger. And since we specified our timing as before, it's now a before statement trigger. It's so simple. So let's create it. Great. Now let's create the after statement trigger. The only thing that we need to change is the timing. Let's do it that. So let's change the name to, and here too. Now let's create it. Great. Now our statement level triggers are ready. So let's create our row level triggers. To create a trigger as a row level, the only thing that we need to do is writing for each row keywords. So let's do it. I simply write for each row. As you can see, it is so simple. So let's run it. But before creating, let's change the names. After row, and in here I write row. Now let's create it. Great. Our first row level trigger is ready. Since its timing is after, our trigger is an after row trigger. Let's now create our last trigger, before row trigger. We just need to change the after keyword with the before. And since this will be a new trigger, we need to change the name, of course. Let's do it. I write before, and before here, and in here too. Now let's run it. Perfect. Our statement and row level triggers are ready. Now it's time to test the triggers. So let's open up the worksheet and make the update. Let's copy that and paste here and write a var clause, because first I will update only one row and see what happens. Var employee ID is equal to 100. Now let's run it. Perfect. As you can see, first our before statement triggers are fired. as our first trigger is also a before statement trigger, it has also fired for once. Then our before row and after row triggers are fired sequentially. Since only one row is affected from this update, they are fired for once. Then the statement has finished and after statement trigger is executed. So our triggers are sequentially fired with starting from the before statement triggers, then before row and after row triggers for each row, then after statement triggers are fired. There can be many same type of triggers. As we can see, there are 2 before statement triggers here. The others can be multiple too, no problem for that. However, this time there might be another problem. Same type of triggers are ran randomly by the server. So the trigger that you want to be run first may run as last. So this can be a problem. You will see how to handle that, but for now, if you don't have any specific reason, you should collect them into one trigger. I mean, for example, in here, we should make one trigger for the first trigger and the before statement amp copy triggers. So you can arrange which code to be run first in the PLCUKL code of the trigger easily. However, it is certain that before statements run before the after statements. The order that I told right before is valid. First, before statements triggers, then before row and after row triggers, then after statement triggers. Before row trigger is executed before the after row trigger for each row. Great. Now let's run an update that updates no rows and see what happens. Let's change the employee ID with the 99, for example, because we know that there is no employee with the 99 employee ID. As you can see, since no row is affected from that DML operation, the before row and after row triggers are not executed. But since statement level triggers only cares the statements, before statement and after statement triggers are executed. We can understand that from the outputs easily. Great. Now let's update more than one rows at the same time and see the effects. Let's write department ID is, let's say, 30. Let's clear up and run the code. Great. As we can see, 6 rows are updated. And in the output text, we can simply see that before statement triggers are executed once, then the before row and after row triggers are executed 6 times, means for each updated rows, then after statement trigger is executed. Perfect. After this example, I think the work logic of the statement level and row level triggers are pretty clear now. So in the next lectures, we can make more complex and real-world examples. So this is the end of this lecture. See you in the next lectures.